The mood in Britain seemed to be as fractious as that in France a week earlier, with a series of apparently unconnected riots in inner cities across the north, in areas hit hardest by the ongoing recession, and the latest news was that, while inflation was down slightly, the economy was still shrinking. And while it probably wasn't at the forefront of most people's minds, England's ignominious exit and Scotland's traditional valiant one in the football might also have contributed to the sense of malaise. Those seeking respite from the economic gloom could head to the cinema, where Stephen King horror film Sleepwalkers was enjoying its first and only week at the top of the UK box office, after Wayne's World and Basic Instinct had been trading that spot for most of the summer. But out this week and ready to dominate the box office was Batman Returns, Tim Burton's sequel from his influential Batman of 2 years earlier, starring Danny DeVito as the Penguin and Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman. Comedy and escapism were the order of the day throughout the cinema. Also in the summer of 1992 you could see Merchant Ivory's literary adaptation Howard's End, legal comedy My Cousin Vinny, seminal sports comedy White Men Can't Jump, family animal shenanigans in Beethoven, ecological animation Fern Gully The Last Rainforest, the third instalments in the Lethal Weapon and Alien series, Cruise Kidman western epic Far and Away, musical comedy Sister Act, Tom Clancy thriller Patriot Games, women's baseball movie A League of Their Own, animated fantasy Cool World, sci-fi actioner Universal Soldier, and fantasy comedies Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Death Becomes Her. It being the 500th anniversary, there were also several films on the theme of Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage across the ocean blue. Christopher Columbus The Discovery, a production nightmare and box office flop, Ridley Scott's 1492 The Conquest of Paradise, disappointing at the box office in the US but better received in Europe, and, completely out of left field, Carry On Columbus, a bawdy British comedy that briefly revived the series that seemed to have died in 1978. This one also flopped and was voted the worst British film ever made in 2004. The teams, meanwhile, had just a few days to make their way from Magny-Cours back through, or around, the French truck drivers' blockade and across the Channel to Northamptonshire. Meanwhile, in York, 14-year-old me, remembering that I'd enjoyed watching the Japanese and Australian races in 1991, and reminded of the existence of Formula One by the media hoopla, tuned in to begin what would become a lifetime interest. Silverstone means Mansell Mania, of course, and in 1992, the media hype was more than ever, as our Nige seemed to be cruising his way to the title. The man himself, noting that in 1986, 87 and 91 he'd won in France and then gone on to win in Britain, did his best to be obliging to the many media calls on his time, notably taking to the streets of London in a 90-year-old Renault, winner of the 1902 Paris to Vienna rally. The other Brits on the grid, Herbert, Brundle, Hill and McCarthy, were also given coverage, particularly Martin, who was the only other Brit in a potentially race-winning car, while Damon was also an object of interest as the son of the great Graham Hill, who never actually won the British Grand Prix but had announced his retirement at Silverstone in 1975. Hill's primary employer, Williams, for whom he was the chief test driver, was still at the centre of the persistent rumour that Alain Prost had signed up with them for 1993 already, or at least was about to, while Ayrton Senna was still being vocal about McLaren needing to either get a better engine or some other technical advantage for 1993 if they wanted to retain his services. He obviously wanted to drive a Williams, but was also said to be testing the waters with Ferrari and not ruling out retiring at the end of the year. Williams, for their part, were still thinking about when to roll out the new FW15 chassis, which they had planned to debut in Canada. Patrick Head explained that the delay was partly because the FW14B was going so well, but also because they still didn't feel the active suspension was reliable enough and wanted to nail that down before they took the plunge. Ferrari had a new F92A shipped over with a new extractor unit and a qualifying special engine, naturally just one of each for a lazy, with Capelli now firmly sidelined. The other Ferrari-powered team on the grid, Scuderia Italia, had a new lower suspension with twin shocks, which they were trying out on JJ's car to see if it solved their handling problems. And there was a boost for Team Lotus as Guy Edwards lined up a major title sponsor, Castrol Oils, who'd been a minor sponsor of Nelson Piquet's title-winning 1983 campaign, but since then had mainly been involved with endurance racing. The newly minted Castrol Team Lotus were hoping for a good result to celebrate. Footwork had set up an electronics department to develop an in-house semi-automatic gearbox, traction control and active suspension, headed up by Rob Williamson, with David Brabham hired on as test driver. Cosworth and Ford, meanwhile, had announced that the long-awaited V12 was finally ready to commence bench testing, and they hoped that with their engine control software they could exceed 14,000 RPM. But there was much work to go, and Dick Scammell of Cosworth said that the Benetton team might still be using the HB V8 in 1993, and thus development on the Series 7 would continue too. And Giancarlo Minardi had a new driver, with Christian Fittipaldi still nursing his cracked vertebra at a Swiss clinic. Alessandro Zanardi, who had done well as a substitute at Jordan late in 1991, would take the wheel until the Brazilian was back, or until someone with more money came along, of course, having beaten Roberto Moreno and fellow Brazilian Maurizio Sandro Sala to the seat. Car 23, Alessandro Zanardi. The young Italian had ended up as series runner-up in International F3000 in 1991 to one Christian Fittipaldi, in an exciting series going down to the last race, which also put him in the F1 frame. The fourth man to pilot Jordan number 32, he drove a great race to 9th on his debut in Barcelona and had a broken gearbox in Japan, then came 9th again in Australia. No points, but clear potential, and he was in the frame to drive the 1992 Tyrrell until Andrea de Cesaris came along with a bigger check at the last minute. With nothing else available at short notice, he was thrown a lifeline. The F3000 Il Barone Rampante team, for whom he'd driven, were regarded as something of a Benetton B team, and the big boys offered him a testing berth. Most of the team's testing was actually done by Schumacher and Brundle, but he got some laps in and an insight into the workings of a top team, which would help put him in good stead. Pre-qualifying had been reassessed following the season midpoint, with the impressive footwork lifted out to be replaced by Gabriele Tarquini, while LaRousse hadn't done quite enough to escape, so PQ would now be 2 each of the Fondmetal, Venturi LaRousse and Andrea Moda cars, with 4 going through. The boys in black had actually arrived, and with engines too, so for the first time in 3 races, both cars could actually run. Friday dawned damp and the teams all set out for PQ with wet tyres on. Andrea Moda held McCarthy back in the pits until late on, by which time the track had dried, but then they took Moreno's used wet tyres off his car and put them on Perry's before sending him out on the drying track. He managed 1 lap time before his clutch packed in, but was still on course to pre-qualify, until everyone else went back out on dry tyres and the natural order of things was restored. Bertrand Gachot was top of the timings by a country mile, followed by Tarquini, Katayama and Chiesa, the latter having written off his shiny new GR02 in France and having to use the old car. McCarthy was beginning to get fed up with this treatment by the team and gave Andrea Sassetti a piece of his mind, as well as raising a bit of much-needed cash by selling Let Pell Out t-shirts, which could be seen in the stands, all of which no doubt improved the atmosphere in the garage no end. Saturday's qualifying session was a washout, so it would be Friday's time that set the grid, though most drivers went out on day 2 anyway to dial in their wet weather settings. Needless to say, Mansell was dominant in qualifying, as he had been pretty much all season, with the cheers from the stands blowing him across the line nearly 2 full seconds ahead of Patrese, and almost exactly 2 full seconds faster than his 1991 pole time, set on super sticky qualifying tyres, with Senna and Schumacher on row 2, then Berger and Brundle. Johnny Herbert made it 3 Brits in the top 7 after an excellent run to outqualify Alesi's Ferrari with its qualifying special engine, with Hakkinen 9th lining up alongside Eric Comas, who'd done well before having a nasty accident on Saturday morning. Like many drivers, Comas had been at a FOCA test at Silverstone in June, the one where Alesi had split his helmet on the steering wheel, and it was noticeable that Boutsen, who hadn't been at the test, was down in 13th. Between the two were Gachot and Alboreto, and Ivan Capelli was down in 14th, only a couple of tenths ahead of Tarquini's Fondmetal. Whatever De Lara had done to their suspension didn't seem to have had much effect, as Leto was 19th, while the underfunded March team continued to struggle with Wendlinger 21st. The Jordans were 23rd and 24th, Morbidelli dragged the Minardi onto the grid 25th, but in 26th place and absolutely delighted was Damon Hill, who would make his Grand Prix debut in front of his home crowd. He displaced Zanardi by just 0.08 of a second, with Belmondo, Chiesa and Van der Poel the others to miss out. Sunday morning was a frantic one for Mika Hakkinen, who slept in and missed the warm-up, thanks to getting stuck in the massive traffic jam. A policeman waved him through onto the hard shoulder, but another further up was less accommodating. After presumably being asked who he thought he was, Nigel Mansell, He was finally allowed to go on his way, though the police held onto his passport and he had an appointment with the magistrate on Monday to explain himself. With 200,000 people making it through the jams to cram into the old airfield, the British Racing Drivers Club, the circuit owners, were beginning to get concerned about the crowds, and while the clouds were gathering and the fans in the stand looked distinctly chilly in a stiff breeze, it looked like it would be a dry race. The parade lap done, the lights went red, then green, and off they went, with Mansell spinning his wheels just enough to allow Prix to surge through into the lead as they streamed into copse, while Brundle got a great start to leap from 6th to 3rd, while behind him a puff of tyre smoke marked where Comas locked up and flat-spotted his tyres. Prix didn't stay ahead for long though, as Mansell retook first place going into Maggots and motored off into the distance, while Prix fended off Brundle and Schumacher fended off Senna, the pair still needling after last week's collision. Senna took the place, followed at Stowe by Berger, while behind the German, Johnny Herbert had taken 6th off a lazy and was having a look at the Benetton too. Berger ran wide at Priory, the lost momentum allowing both Schumacher and Herbert through, so at the end of an eventful first lap, Mansell led Prix by about 3 seconds, followed by Brundle, Senna, Schumacher, Herbert, Berger, Alesi, Comas and Hakkinen. Schumacher was continuing to attack Senna, who wasn't giving way, but despite a couple of hairy moments, the two stayed where they were, as Mansell finished lap 2 over 5 seconds in the lead. Surely he wasn't naturally that much faster than Prix, even with home advantage. Ricciardo must surely be deliberately holding back the others to allow Nigel to stretch out at the front, or maybe he was just that demoralised. Not that Mansell wasn't pushing, because he was, approaching the lap record already despite full tanks, as Schumacher continued harrying Senna and Herbert continued fending off Berger and Alesi. Hakkinen, who hadn't started as well as Herbert, made up a place on lap 5, passing a vibrating Comas for 9th, as Mansell extended his lead over Prix to 12 seconds. As the opening laps went by, the race developed into a number of small groups, with Prix pulling away a little from Brundle, who led a 3-car Senna sandwich, then another gap back to the Herbert-Berger-Alesi trio, with Hakkinen trying to attach himself to the back of it. Soon enough, Mansell, now with over a 20-second lead after the first 10 laps or so, was approaching Damon Hill, still at the back in the Brabham, to put a lap on him, and Pierluigi Martini, an unhappy 25th in the evil-handling Dallara. The leader had throttled back already and lost a bit more time as he reached Damon through Stowe, but he was in no danger of losing his lead. Behind the two Williamses, things had been static in terms of position changes, but the Senna sandwich and the now 4-way scrap between Herbert, Berger, Alesi and Hakkinen were still running close together and providing plenty of entertainment, with a third close scrap now developing between 10th placed Comas, chased by Alboreto and Capelli. Herbert had actually pulled out a bit of a lead over Berger, while Hakkinen was really going at Alesi, as the Senna sandwich reached and started making its way through the back markers. Mansell, for his part, lapped the man he'd replaced at Williams, Thierry Boutsen, who was running 16th in the Ligier, followed by De Cesaris in the Tyrrell. Senna and Brundle were of course old rivals going back to Formula 3 in 1983, though Martin had more experience of being traffic of late, and Senna nearly nipped through at one point, but the Benettons were just working better here today and Senna couldn't find a way past, as Hakkinen made his way past Alesi into 8th and set about Berger. Lapping Gugelmin, Senna nearly tripped over his old friend, and Schumacher nearly made it through, but again Senna made his car as wide as possible, and the order remained, as the three were closing back up on Prix, as Eric Comas came in for tyres just before 1/3 distance, at which point, remarkably, all 26 cars were still running. Senna had another go at Brundle, whose line through Beckett seemed to be less straight than it could have been, but the Ford V8 just had the legs on the Honda V12 when on the power, and Martin could just outdrag the McLaren. The trio lapped Guiar with no issues, a relief after Magny-Cours, and continued to be the best viewing on the track, much as the legion of Mansell fans at home would no doubt have preferred to watch their hero's triumphant progress. Incidentally, Murray Walker's commentary here.
Yes, the man in the black hat at Magny-Cours in more ways than one. Black crash hat and got himself a very bad reputation. More of that maybe later.
Is one that for whatever reason has just stuck with me for 32 years. I still think of Olivier Guiard as the man in the black hat. Since Murray never did get round to elaborating, and this was the first race I'd watched this year, I never did find out what Olivier had actually done in France until making the French Grand Prix video a couple of weeks ago. On lap 29, Berger was the first of the lead cars to pit for tyres, as the race had its first retirements. Katayama and Wendlinger both with transmission and gearbox issues respectively, but neither made the TV coverage because now Mansell was coming in for his own tyre stop, a 39-second cushion over Prix. A leisurely 11.7-second stop got him out comfortably ahead of his teammate, who would no doubt not be pushing hard to take advantage of the cold tyres. The Williams pit actually held a sign out for Patrese saying Mansell tyres OK, so perhaps he wouldn't actually be stopping himself at all. Johnny Herbert's race was run after 31 laps, a problem somewhere between his gear paddles and his wheels, as the McLaren team were getting a set of wheels ready for Senna. That was just over half distance, with just 3 retirements, and Schumacher peeled in to change tyres, presumably hoping to find some advantage to get past Senna, and Brundle, emerging after a quick stop in 6th, just behind Häkkinen, and a lazy also stopped. That took some of the heat off Senna, who was still trying every trick he knew trying to get past Brundle, but to no avail. Capelli made his stop, parking badly and apparently engaging reverse rather than first gear when he got underway again, though whether that was Ivan's fault or a flaky Ferrari gearbox was unclear, as Senna chased Brundle past the battling backmarkers of Comas and Leto, who were in turn about to put another lap on Damon Hill. As 2/3 distance arrived, the beleaguered Jordan team had another double whammy of bad luck, as first the Yamaha V12 on Gugelmin's car cried enough, and then Schumacher, pushing hard to catch up after his stop, biffed Stefano Modena, just like he'd done in France, only this time both of them got away with it. But Stefano's car had already been in the wars, banging wheels with De Cesaris, and his engine gave out just a couple of laps later. Alesi had an unusual exit, his fire extinguisher going off in the cockpit on lap 44, as Senna continued in Brundle's wheel tracks despite his worn tyres giving him increasing vibrations. Another driver struggling with his tyres was Mika Häkkinen in 5th, who was valiantly holding off the attentions of Berger and Schumacher, both on fresher tyres and with just 1 point between their respective teams in the Constructors' Championship. Eventually, Berger made it through on Hangar Straight on lap 49, with Schumacher following through under the bridge, leaving the Lotus 7th and dropping back as its tyres were on the raggedy edge. There were just 10 laps to go now, but not for Andrea De Cesaris, whose rear suspension, damaged by his earlier tangle with Modena, gave way at Nuffield and was briskly removed by some brave marshals. And still Brundle and Senna were going at it hammer and tongs as they had been all race. The pair lapped the black and red Fonmetal of Gabriele Tarquini, while Mansell was putting another lap on Martini, with his lead over Patrese now stretched back out to 28 seconds. Just 7 laps from the end, Senna pulled out and finally got past Brundle, only for his transmission to pack up at Club Corner, almost beneath a homemade banner reading "Don't worry Nigel, only nuts come from Brazil." Nigel certainly didn't seem worried, setting a new lap record on the same lap, some 3 seconds quicker than last year's record, as he continued his apparently unstoppable progress to the win. 14th place Morbidelli ground to a halt with no oil pressure on lap 55 of 59, far enough to be classified, as Senna sat on his wheel at Club Corner, possibly hoping to thumb a lift from Mansell on the slowing down lap like last year. Mansell set another lap record with 2 laps to go, while Schumacher set the second fastest time of the day as he continued chasing Berger. Mansell lapped Damon Hill for the 4th time just as he began his last lap, and the roars of the crowd were almost audible over the screaming engines, as he came home to take his 28th Grand Prix win, beating Jackie Stewart's record to become the British driver with the most wins and take his 2nd Grand Chelem, pole, win, fastest lap and led every lap of the year. As Hill followed him across the line, the crowd broke ranks and surged onto the tracks. It had become something of a tradition at Silverstone, but it was still an insanely dangerous thing to do, with 17 cars still out on the track, most of them at full racing speed. Patrese finished 2nd for Williams' 6th 1-2 in 9 races of 1992, with Brundle taking a well-deserved 3rd to make the podium a repeat of Magny-Cours. Berger's engine exploded as he came up to the line, promoting Schumacher to 4th in the dying seconds, and Häkkinen nursed his tyres to bring his Lotus home 6th, a solitary point, scant reward for the team's excellent race, but appreciated nonetheless. Alboreto finished 7th, again, at the head of the rest, as Mansell took a Union Jack proffered by one of the fans and made his way slowly home, followed by a whole clutch of cars. Nigel miraculously managed not to mow down any of the fans on the track, but was clearly not going to make it back to the pits, despite the despairing efforts of the marshals and police. And Damon Hill was also receiving a certain amount of attention too, as the other cars threaded their way gingerly through, revving their engines to announce their arrival. Mansell climbed out of the cockpit on Club Corner and was clearly enjoying the attention, as Frank Williams and co. hoped there'd be enough left of the car to recover, not to mention the issue of scrutineering. Mansell was finally bundled into a coarse van which made its way back to the pits, sirens wailing, while Brundle made it back under his own steam. As Mansell arrived back at the Parc Fermé, he was spotted having a quick word with head scrutineer Charlie Whiting and took to the podium to enjoy his victory, while Brundle got a cheer almost as big as Mansell's when he hefted his trophy.
Tears of joy go down Nigel Mansell's face, and there's a break in my voice, I'll tell you.